your words have power. You know, we know that the great speeches, Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, words have real power, and it's not to be ignored. And we are empowering ourselves, and the words that come out of our mouth should be considered and incredibly positive.
Welcome to the Lifestyle First podcast, discussing lifestyle medicine and making self-care as easy as 1, 2, 3. And now your host, lifestyle medicine physician and coach, Dr. Alka Patel.
Hi, hey, and hello, and welcome to Series 10, Episode 2 of the Lifestyle First podcast. And we are now talking about I for identity today. And the one question that we're exploring is, how does your superego influence your identity? And to help answer that, I have with me Ashton Smythe. Ashton is a love and mindset coach. So welcome, Ashton.
Welcome. Thank you for having me.
Great to have you here. Now, look, we're talking about the ego today, which is something that I know you do work on and focus on. But I really wanted to just zone in a little bit on that word ego, because I think for most of us, we do immediately think of Sigmund Freud and his work on the ego and the id when we think of the word ego. But for people who may not be familiar with his work, I thought it would be useful just to give a little bit of background to the word ego and perhaps where that comes from and what we mean by that. So Sigmund Freud, as you know, he was a doctor in Vienna, and he observed his patients, and through that he developed very deep psychoanalytical theories about personality. And what he proposed was that your personality, your identity, is really made up of 3 key elements, which he called the id, the ego, and the superego. So according to Freud, your id, your ID, your id, it's the only component of your personality that's present from birth. So it's entirely unconscious. It's all those very instinctive and primitive behaviors that we have. And he proposed that this is driven by the pleasure principle. And we'll recognize this, won't we, as that need for instant gratification. So that's the id. And then he then describes the ego, which then develops from the id. So what the ego does is that it ensures that all those impulses of the id can be expressed in a much more acceptable manner in the real world that we live in. So it's a part of your personality that really deals with reality, because I'm sure we all recognize that you can't fulfill your needs immediately. It's not always very realistic. So the ego operates on the reality principle, so that we're just more socially appropriate. And then there's that third tier, is the final component of our personality that develops. And this is what Freud calls the superego. And he says that emerges at around the age of 5. And that's all about holding moral standards and the ideals. So this is what we acquire from our parents and from society. And it's very judgment based. So what the superego tries to do is it tries to suppress those primal urges of the id, and it makes the ego behave much more morally rather than realistically. So I thought it was useful just to give a little bit of background on some of those sort of psychoanalytical theories. But what I really wanted to ask you, Ashton, to kick us off really was, where do you see perhaps the difficulties arising in your experiences and through your work in this interplay that we have between the id, the ego, and the superego? What's your experience?
Okay, so just to set the background, I work with predominantly women over 30 to find romantic love. So how the superego comes to play is how women see themselves, how they identify the self. So as you said, that this is something that develops from childhood, from the age of 5, and these identities that we borrow and adapt from our parents, whether they be social or cultural, and then how we see ourselves, how we relate to the I am, who we see ourselves as. So it's how we see ourselves and how we will then allow ourselves to evolve and how we'll interpret love. So it has a massive impact on how love and relationships show up, because we set these belief systems and this identity of what we're allowed to have based upon, our experiences as we grow up from the age of 5 into adolescence, teenage years, and we set these boundaries and limitations based on belief systems. So how does it influence it? It literally is everything. It controls who you become. And one of the phrases that I use an awful lot is from the Bible, which is, as a woman thinketh, so is it done unto her. So as you see yourself, if you see yourself being happy, then you will develop a happy life. If you see yourself struggling based upon your identity, then that's what will come to pass.
Yeah, and that's really interesting, isn't it? Because it is very much about perception as well, and the interplay between ego and superego, and what is reality and what is morality, and what actually guides our decision making is very steeply based on judgments, not only judgments we make about ourselves and how we see ourselves, but of course those that come from the external as well. I was listening to a TEDx talk about called The Other Side of Ego. It's by Jonathan Gravenor. He's a journalist, and he talks about ego in his TEDx talk, but he talks about it by sharing a very, very moving personal story. And we really should have a listen to this if you haven't already, everybody listening. But he talks about the judgments that he makes about a homeless man and a little child who play a very poignant part in his life. And I think if we do pause, I think we can all recognize that it is judgments, morality that we make of others. It's our superego that ultimately shapes that person that we are and shapes our identity and how we show up in the world, how we show up in relationships, in what we do, who we hang out with, how we feel. So how do we then quieten this superego? Because it's not always the most helpful. And I know you talk about the silent ego. So tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, so I got this from Todd Herman's book, which is called the Alter Ego Effect. And in that, he talks about neutral thinking, he talks about quietening the ego, and then adopting an alter ego. And if I take it in reverse, so we're aware of Beyonce and Adele, who adopt alter egos to perform. So they create, like actors and actresses, they create identities of themselves, Sasha Fierce and different people, to enable them to perform and do other things. There's creating an alter ego. But creating a quiet ego is by understanding that the super ego acts essentially from a position of fear, that we're concerned and worried about things, and we're concerned about the world around us impacting us. So that's where judgments come into place. So this fear-based thinking is when the ego presents itself. So if we silence that ego and move from a kind of more holistic world view rather than our personal view, so we stand away from an event, we can then silence that ego and look at it from another perspective. So let me give you an actual example that occurred last week. So I had a client who had a family member, a very close family member, berate her verbally. It was so bad that her daughter got involved in that situation and caused outrage. So whilst we were speaking, I said, well, how do you feel about that? She said, well, I'm very upset. And I said, I believe that's the ego speaking. Why don't we move away from that pain and look at it from a more holistic view and not think about the self, quiet the ego? How do you know the person? Yes, family member, fantastic. Do you know their background? Yes. Can you see the pain that they're in? How must they feel and think to have done what they've done? So when we start looking at it from somebody else's point of view, from a wider perspective, we desensitize ourselves. So we quieten the ego. And then we say, right, well, actually, they must be in a really bad place. Okay, so stop thinking about ourselves and then look at it energetically. Well, they really must be in a bad place. We did a little exercise, which is a bit spiritual, where we changed the lens, our focus, our perspective on that person. And we refused to see them as a victim of their life. And we saw them how we wanted to see them. as a loving person that's probably having their own struggle. And that client was able to do that for a week. And then they came together with this individual who had criticized them, and they had a wonderful positive exchange based upon silencing the ego, not thinking about self and thinking about the bigger picture, and being able to have a conversation without negative emotion and seeing that I'm okay. I don't actually need to fear people, and I'm not being criticized. There is no judgment here. I'm okay. Let me feel for the other person. Let me see them not as a victim, but as a person on their own path. And let me, through my own lens, see them differently. And this attracted a different experience from the person, and a pleasurable, honest, vulnerable conversation, which would not have taken place if the ego hadn't been silenced. Does that make sense?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. That's such a beautiful example of really raising your awareness and, first of all, noticing that there even is this sense of superego, a judgmental side of you, perhaps a side that we don't always want to identify with. But the moment that you can notice that, then actually you're in a position to then change that and influence that. So that's a really useful example of how, on a practical level, on a day-to-day level, those conversations that we have, because life is about connection and communication, isn't it? Can be really heavily influenced by what we decide, what decisions we make, what lens we're going to look at, what identity we choose for the people that are in front of us. But in that same example, back to our original question for this episode, how does your superego influence your identity? How did it shape her own sense of herself?
So essentially what she was able to do, looking back on it when we reflected, is she didn't see herself as the victim in the story. You know, she's looking at the story, she's being criticized. And then the ego, seeing her adopting fear and seeing herself as the victim. What we're able to do is look at it from the other person's perspective and seeing them in a struggle and neutralizing her feelings on it. So she moved her emotions and moved to positive emotions and thinking about the other person. So she no longer saw herself as the victim in this solution, and she was able to reach out into this conversation and help the other person. And I think that's the way that, you know, she learned from that. She learned two lessons. One was there was an energetic lesson that she didn't need to have a conversation with this person. It was about her projection, the other person. And also, by silencing the ego, not seeing herself as a victim and not adopting this perception of pain, but looking through and seeing the other person as having a struggle and assisting that person. So being selfless. Hopefully that's kind of answered it.
Yeah, for sure. So I think there's a strong lesson for all of us there, isn't there, really, is that our perception of the world influences straight back the person that we are. And it's almost that mirroring effect as well, or at least having that sort of what you perceive in the world reflected right back at you as an important shaper of then who you are and how you show up. And just picking up on something else you said then there about she didn't identify as a victim. I think words are so powerful, aren't they? We immediately attach meaning to words, and we all attach different meaning to words. We conjure up different visuals, we have different associations. So how important do you think words are in your identity and utilizing words and language to really create that sense of who you are?
That's a good one. I was literally talking about this last night. So I talk about the power of the spoken word, and the client was asking me, just saying, well, I shouldn't be self-critical. So words are powerful because we speak things into existence, and so are thoughts. But I always say, you know, that a verbal command is a command to the subconscious, a command on how to be. So in terms of how we speak things into existence, I think we're pre-programming our subconscious to allow us to see the solution or not to see the solution. So if we're in that kind of victim mentality and we're speaking it out, so we're saying, how dare this person, you know, we're creating that energy that is then feeding back on us and feeding the momentum. We've also got these external factors, because there's a third party. There's this client's daughter who's also interpreting this as a frustration and an outrage. And this is just kind of building this negative momentum and not allowing you to see it. So then if you're participating and agreeing by word and by thought and by frustration, and you just kind of spiraling down in this negative cycle, you by affirmation, you're pointing yourself in a negative direction, and that pressure's building up, and there's a force and a desire to be righted, to fix this assumed situation. Because a lot of this is not direct communication. It's somebody said something to somebody else, and it's perception, and it not necessarily did this thing actually happen the way we think it did. And then we're building this momentum with our words and our emotions and taking it out of all proportion. So yeah, I think it's important, to be very aware. I actually say to my clients, your words have power. We know that the great speeches, Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, words have real power, and it's not to be ignored. And we are empowering ourselves, and the words that come out of our mouth should be considered and incredibly positive, because who wants to negatively influence ourselves? No, thank you.
Yeah, totally. There's a reverberance and an energy associated with the words we use, isn't there? So then, speaking of words, one final question then to you is ego and egotistics.
Yeah.
Difference, isn't there? Now, sometimes we talk about ego and we always think of it in perhaps the negative, but there's a difference between your ego and being egotistic. Can you just clarify that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is something that I have done some work on, and I'll draw a parallel between confidence and arrogance. In order to project a degree of confidence in professional life, that can sometimes go adrift and be more negative. So confidence can be perceived as arrogance. So the ego, when you mention the ego, it is often assumed that you're being egotistical, controlling. It's a very, very different thing. I think it's a negative connotation of the ego, where somebody is their self-esteem is perhaps off the radar, and they're projecting themselves as better than others. So being egotistical is that negative aspect of ego, where somebody is propelling themselves above other people and creating this negative force, where the ego is really just about how we see ourselves. Is that reflection of state the I am, how we identify moving forward, and the belief systems that we put around ourselves, social, cultural, and then go. In fact, I think the best word for it is the ego is the mask that we wear, who we believe we are, but who we believe other people think we are. And then we adopt that scenario. A lot of people live into the reflection of other people around them and who they believe they are. So we adopt all of that. So just to summarize that, egotistical for me is the negative, inflated version of ego, where ego is just the questioning and asking, who am I? And what self am I? How do I identify? How have I learned to adopt to the world around me, from my parents, from society, for environment? Who do I feel comfortable with? Yeah. I guess I see it maybe with a slightly different sense. Perhaps less of the mask, but really more of the core essence of who you are, that your ego is the essence of you, which is why we get very defensive when your ego is challenged. So if at your core, there's something about you, about honesty or kindness or patience or truth or justice, and then you find yourself in situations where that ego, that essence of you,
is challenged, that's when you almost go into the extremes. The egotistic comes out because you're trying to defend what is very much at your core. So that reflex defense is very much what we then see in terms of behaviors of people that we then put our own judgments on, but actually maybe don't pause to recognize that there's something here that lies at a core value that is trying to be expressed and that you're automatically defending against. So it's fascinating to think of this with so many different and different.
I love that and agree with that. I would add on to it that the ego and the self-identity, it changes, it evolves, but a lot of it is borrowed and assumed. And we can live in, I do love a stereotype. So we can live into a stereotype or who we are perceived to be. So I'm perceived to be an incredibly confident person. You speak to my wife of 30 years, she will tell you that at times I'm shy and not confident. At times I'm introverted. Most of the time I'm extroverted. So the perception of me is when people, especially people who don't know me, is interesting, and I understand it, but I understand that is not me. At times I've lived into that stereotype and that identity and ego, and that can take me adrift sometimes, and just need to. I was having a conversation with somebody and said, actually, you're quite introverted, but I'm a definite extrovert. I do a lot of meditation and I come from within, and I have a very strong self-identity of who I am. But I also know how I project and what comes across. But I've specifically moved away from that identity and then taken what you said, that true ego, the true self-identity, and I've moved back into that deliberately. So I think that's probably the other thing, that the identity is not fixed. It evolves, I believe, in 7-year cycles. I think Erik Erikson developed the theory of the cycle of evolution, how your identity changes. But you can do this deliberately. You can adopt silent egos, alter egos, and you can change who you are. I think the last thing I'd like to say is we're not human beings, we're human becomings. We are evolving, we're forever changing. We're not a fixed entity, we're always becoming and changing the new version of ourselves. So I always refer to us as humans becoming. Who are we becoming? Who are we evolving into?
And now, here is your lifestyle first prescription. Your 3 activating actions to take you from knowing to doing.
Which leads us then nicely, doesn't it, into the final part of today's episode, which is really for you to leave us with 3 actions, 3 things that we can do or think about. Because I think pausing and taking some space to have some introspection, really think about yourself is so important for all of us. So what 3 things do you want us to maybe pause on and think about and really get connected to our identity, not the one that society has asked us to lead, but really from that central place and that changing, evolving place? Give us 3 actions, Ashton.
Okay, so the first one is ask. So ask yourself a powerful introspective question, like, if my identity is changeable, how might I change it to have a better, happier, superior life? Right? So firstly, if you don't agree with that statement and you think, well, no, my identity is not changeable, it's fixed, well, then just say, okay, I agree with you. But if it was changeable, so ask yourself a really powerful question and a really series of questions, starting with, if my identity was changeable, how could I change it and how would this empower my life? Right? That's a really interesting question, and you can just really get very introverted with that question. The second one is learn to quiet your ego, right? So we've discussed that a little bit. So my recommendation on that would be to read Todd Herman's book, The Alter Ego Effect. And it gives you some good strategies on how to do that. Alternatively, you could just meditate, which is quietening the mind, which is a good solution. So learn how to quiet the the ego, and look for this bigger picture. Think the wider picture. And the third one, which I've touched on already, is to think. Is to think of yourself not as a human being, as a human becoming. Because when you were born, I didn't have this personality type. In fact, this personality type I deliberately created 4 years ago. I said, I want to be like this. I want to be a coach. I'm going to need to be more introverted. I need to listen more. I need to be more empathetic. So I said, I want to be like this. And I've evolved into this human being in the last 4 years deliberately. So think of yourself as a human becoming. Who am I becoming? Who do I want to become? I'm evolving. 0 to 7, you're a certain way. 7 to 14, you're a different way. 14 to 21, I'm a little bit older than that now, and I've evolved into a new person. And who do I want to become? What habits do I want to create that will empower me and make me happy ultimately, and allow me to become the person I want to? Just think of yourself as a human becoming, and what does the future hold for you, and move towards that deliberately.
Wonderful. Thank you. Ask, quieten, think.
Yeah.
Love that. Love that. And I'm sure on the back of that, Ashton, people are going to want to get in touch with you, find out more about your work. So where's the best place to reach out to you?
Okay, so 2 places. Firstly, my website, all the W's, loveorangeplanet.com. I'm a love and mindset coach. I predominantly work with single women over 30 to find their soulmates, soulmate love. So I'm not a relationship coach. I'm a pre-love coach. I find single women and I help them find soulmates. So that's the first place. The second place is my podcast, Orange Tinted Glasses, which you can find everywhere there are podcasts. And that's me a little bit loose-lipped and fun, just ranting and talking about funny stuff, love, life, and living. So yeah, look out for the podcast, Orange Tinted Glasses. And yes, another really good place to find me.
Great. I will put all those links up onto the show notes for everyone to reach out for you. Thank you for a wonderful conversation. You've left us with lots of things to act and think about and reflect on. So thank you so much. And that now simply leaves me to wish everyone listening a happy, healthy day.
Thanks for joining us on the Lifestyle First podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and share. To learn more, please visit www.dralkapatel.com.